Major funding for Lone Star is provided by Foley's and Sanger Harris, divisions of Federated Department Stores Incorporated, the John G. and Marie Stella Kennedy Memorial Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional funding is provided by the following organizations:
Texans deliberately created a state government with very limited powers.
My recollection is that 3 people voted all day long, and that was back in 1952. In the Republican primary, they were all voting in the Democratic primary then. Me, my wife, and 1 drunk Democrat.
You know, they used to say that Texas bragged about being under 6 flags, and when old Daniel got elected, they said Texas under 6 flags and a flour sack.
There was a debate going on whether or not Spanish could be used in the public schools. And Ma Ferguson said that if the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was good enough for the school children of Texas.
Probably because no monumental issues or livelihoods depend upon who is elected governor of Texas. Gubernatorial politics has always taken on a colorful, gaudy, and spectator sport quality.
I'm Larry Hagman. A favorite saying on the Texas frontier was root, hog, or die. Now, this was not the quaint, folksy phrase we think of it as today. Rather, it had a basis in hard reality. It arose among the settlers who turned their hogs out to forage for themselves, as later they did with their cattle. And it showed a frontier, pragmatic frame of mind that applied to more than hogs. A frame of mind that has never really disappeared among the white-collar descendants of those early Texans. The people who entered Texas were expected to root. They set their own goals, and they carried them out in their own way. That rugged individualism stems from the philosophy that they brought with them across the Appalachians or out of Europe. God helps those who help themselves. And that attitude has been at the heart of the Texans' view of their government and their politicians since Stephen F. Austin set up the first Anglo colony under the Mexican government. And it hadn't changed.
Fellow Texans, I am proudly standing here to humbly see. I assure you, and I mean it. Now who says I don't speak out as plain as day? And fellow Texans, I'm for progress and the flag, long may it fly. I'm a poor boy, come to greatness. So it follows that I cannot tell a lie.
Politicians were something like cockroaches. That it wasn't what they eat and toted off, it's what they fell into and messed up.
Ooh, I love to dance a little sidestep. Now they see me, now they don't. I've come and gone. And ooh, I love to sweep around the wide step. Cut a little swat and leave the people alone.
Somebody said yes, and they're like bullfrogs too. Said what ain't belly's head, and that's mostly mouth.
Texas politics have always been colorful, sparked, if not illuminated, by the regular display of fireworks. I am
enjoy covering Texas politics very much. There's also a tendency of Texas politicians, unlike other politicians, to not take themselves that seriously. Now, they really do take what they're doing very seriously. I don't mean to suggest they don't. But I mean, you know, they know how to, they all have a sense of humor about it.
If you wanted to describe the Texas philosophy of government, I guess the best way you could describe it would be for a Texan to say, "Get off my property." He ain't gonna bother nobody, and he sure don't want nobody bothering him.
I have the feeling that Texas politics has been individualistic and probably more colorful than that of most states, for the very reason that we were a one-party state so long.
You know, there were no two people in Texas politics who hated each other more than Ralph Yarborough and Lyndon Johnson, as Ralph Yarborough used to. And I mean, Yarborough really did believe that when he went out to make a speech at an outdoor rally, say, in Midland or somewhere, and it rained, that Lyndon Johnson was responsible for causing it to rain on his picnic.
We had a heritage of rugged individualism, which carried over into the political arena. People didn't try to mold or model themselves after some other pattern, but there were a lot of distinct individualistic patterns that developed.
If there have been a lot of fireworks in Texas politics, the fuse was lit early in the first presidential elections in the Texas Republic, when it was Sam Houston against the likes of Mirabeau B. Lamar and David G. Burnett. The two old war horses each tried to prove that the other one was the bigger liar, drunkard, and public thief.
They accused Houston of everything possible to try to, although he's the hero of San Jacinto, they accused him of being a drunk. The Houston people would come back and say, "Houston, drunken in a ditch, is worth 1,000 of Burnett and Lamar." They also accused him of being a coward. And so scurrilous were the remarks by both sides, and Houston saying certain things about Burnett, that Burnett challenged him to a duel. And Houston's not about to get into anything like this. But he said, "I never fight downhill."
Although he may not have been popular with certain of his contemporaries, Houston was extremely popular with the people. When Texas became a state, they sent him to the U.S. Senate.
Often in the Senate, you'd find him whittling and wearing his leopard skin vest, his feet propped on the table. And he had a lot of comments to make about the Senate, too. But he was an accurate observer of all things that affected his adopted state, the state of Texas.
Houston had no great faith in lesser men, yet he held his own word and honor sacrosanct. No Texan ever inspired more confidence. He had monstrous ambitions. Even as late as 1860, he had never given up hope of becoming President of the United States. Yet, he sacrificed ambition to honor many times.
He's sitting in the United States Senate, and this debate's going on about the Confederacy and the right to secede, and will we have a civil war or won't we? And so he resigns his seat and comes home and runs for the governorship of the state of Texas and wins, and takes office as the governor of the state of Texas and declares himself that this is the purpose that I came back here for, was to keep Texas in the Union. The state was very severely divided on this issue, but nevertheless, Sam Houston, as the sitting governor and the hero of Texas, debating the issue, he lost, and the convention, by a narrow margin, seceded from the Union. And he resigned his governorship with his conviction, and the story historically is that he died of a broken heart because of this. And I think that's a marvelous, wonderful story.
The man's life is a Greek drama, having been rejected twice, once in Tennessee, once in Texas, having had disastrous relationships with women, And then finding a wonderful woman who married him late in life, bore him 8 children. I'm very fond of Houston.
He could be as profane as a beer party in a church, or as unexpectedly devout as a prayer in a saloon. What a man.
There was no one like Sam Houston, but a string of colorful political figures has occupied the governor's mansion, to the delight of many Texans and the disgust of others. One of these was James Stephen Hogg.
He ran for Attorney General in 1886, and he really had much going for him. Not only was his father a Civil War general, but he also had the name Hogg. And because of his huge proportions, he was 6'3" and weighed 250. People could identify, remember the name. He was Texas-born, which is unusual. I think, as I recollect, he is the first Texas-born governor.
Hogg campaigned with the awareness that there were more common people in Texas than any other kind. He knew the dirt farmer's soul and which illusions grabbed his mind. Hogg was a flaming reformer on the stump, standing against everything the embattled farmer hated, inventing some things the farmer had not yet imagined.
Hogg was such a big man. It'd be in the hot summertime, no loudspeakers, no electronic aids. You had to be heard. And that's one reason they picked Clark to run against him. They could both be heard by a crowd of 10,000 people out in the open without loudspeakers. And the heat of the summer, when the campaigns were waged, they'd get thirsty, and when they'd pass them glasses of water, pass up a pitcher, Hogg would just take that pitcher and turn it sideways and drink the whole pitcher without stopping the pitcher of water like that. And that, the crowd loved that. It was a campaigning technique.
Hogg helped pass the first antitrust law. Like 4 weeks of being the first antitrust law in the nation. And he used this vigorously against railroads, against insurance companies, against all types of corporations in behalf of the people. Therefore, Hogg became known as a man of the people.
I think the story about Jim Hogg that I've heard that I like the best, and I'm not sure of the truth of it, was that when he was buried out here at the state cemetery, he instructed them to plant a pecan tree at the head of his grave, and I believe a walnut tree at the foot of his grave. And he said that we should take the fruits and feed the school children of Texas. A poetic fellow.
In 1914, another colorful governor appeared. James E. Ferguson was to be at or near the center of Texas politics for 30 years. Ferguson liked office, but was a man without a mission. He tailored his campaigns to the electorate's foibles and desires.
James E. Ferguson was probably the most colorful campaigner after Jim Hogg. He was a small-town banker from Belton. He ran for the governorship. At the time he started, a few political prognosticators in Texas gave him any chance of being elected. But he was elected, and I have talked with men who heard him campaign, and he would describe the plight of the tenant farmer in Texas.
He was known as Farmer Jim Ferguson. He ran a newspaper called the Ferguson Forum and published all kind of folksy information for people down on, as he referred to, on the forks of the creek, and he was the little man's candidate and always speaking to the little man.
As governor, Ferguson seized attention by beginning a massive pardons program, freeing convicted felons by the hundreds. This served 2 purposes. It was not unpopular with the rank and file, and it cut state expenditures.
One of the stories I remember was that he invited some people that were trying to get their son out of the penitentiary to take a ride out in the country with him. And he went out to his farm and he showed him a fine mule he had out there. And he said, "That's a fine mule." Said, "I just don't have use for him anymore." But said, "That's a $10,000 mule. And I will sell it to you." And they said, "What in the world would we do with a mule?" Said, "Well, your son could ride him home from the penitentiary."
I know one time Jim made a trip to Washington to see about something, and his political opponents put out on him that while he was in Washington, he stayed in a hotel room that it cost $50 a day, which was lots of money back in those days, and they accused him of it from the political stump and the speakings and all, and in answer to that, Jim would always get up and say, "Now, folks, you know that old Jim Ferguson many a day has slept under a wagon sheet on the public square where the dew and the frost fell upon him." And he said, "If it had just been old Jim Ferguson going to Washington, I'd have probably slept in the wagon yard up there." But he said, "Folks, I went to Washington as governor of the great state of Texas, and I know that you people wanted your governor to stay in the very best of places," and everybody would holler and cheer.
Flamboyant and colorful, Ferguson got into trouble because he attacked an important institution of the state, the developing University of Texas at Austin.
Ferguson became very unpopular because he vetoed the University of Texas appropriation. The ex-students marched, and they descended, they demanded the impeachment, and Ferguson was so bold he thought he could survive that.
The legislature had been investigating Ferguson's affairs. There apparently was some misuse of funds. State monies had been deposited to a bank in which Ferguson held stock. And most spectacular of all, it appeared that the governor had an unrepaid loan of $156,000 from the Texas Brewers Association.
His enemies had gotten so vocal that they were able to cause him to be impeached in the Senate on 10 grounds of wrongful use of state funds or some other thing. Now, he always said it was his effort to change the university system that made him, threw him out.
Ferguson was barred by terms of his impeachment from ever again holding office in Texas. Showing an ingenuity that would later be remembered by men with similar problems of being barred from office by law, Ferguson entered his wife's name in the Democratic primary. Ma Ferguson, as she was known, was news merely by being in office. The first woman in the United States to win a full term as governor. But Ferguson himself was governor of Texas in everything but name.
He was sitting on a platform at a railway station in West Texas and thought of his wife running. So his wife, Ma Ferguson, announced for governor. She became the first woman ever elected to be a governor in the United States. And she ran, they immediately began to say, "Well, Jim Ferguson, old Farmer Jim, will sit in the back room and run things." Well, he did, but he sat in the front room. Before you saw him on, you passed Jim, and he ran things. But the Ferguson's answer was, Jim Ferguson had 2 governors for the price of 1. This became their campaign motto, 2 governors for the price of 1, and they called her Ma Ferguson. So the printed bumper stickers, I've seen them all over East Texas, "Me for Ma." And that was the campaign. He was a terrific campaigner. And they survived that impeachment and removal from office.
They said that after Jim was impeached and his wife got elected governor, that she was on the elevator there in the Capitol one day going up to her office, and somebody got on the elevator and stepped on her foot, and he says, "Pardon me, Miss Ferguson," and she said, "You'll have to see Jim about that."
The problem is that no one has ever given Ma the credit, I think, that she deserved for being a pretty opinionated and tough lady in her own right, not just a mouthpiece for Pa. My favorite story about Ma was that there was a debate going on whether or not the Hispanic-speaking children, the Spanish-speaking children in Texas, should have some sort of bilingual books in the public school systems, and whether or not Spanish could be used in the public schools. And Ma Ferguson said that if the English language was good enough for Jesus Christ, it was good enough for the school children of Texas.
But they always say that all Ma did was a rubber stamp for Farmer Jim. She did what he wanted. Well, I know of at least one case where she wasn't a rubber stamp. In the biggest issue of all, the legislature began to grumble again and wanted to impeach if they were just in session. So Jim told Ma to issue a proclamation and call them in session. She said, well, they're talking about impeachment, says they won't impeach. She said, Jim, you said that before and you called them in session. I'm not going to call them in session. And she didn't.
After losing to Dan Moody in the election of 1926, the Fergusons came storming back amongst the economic discontent of 1932. Ma was elected, but the problems of the Depression proved so overwhelming that the Fergusons withdrew from politics in 1934.
Oh, I think Ma and Pop Ferguson fall into the category of the great Democratic leaders in Massachusetts, in Boston, the Curleys, or the Dailies in Chicago. They appear in all states. I think they're to be seen that way as part of the early 20th century phenomenon. It was an anti-intellectual movement, a nativist movement, a very rough and ready movement. You had it in Oklahoma. You had it in a variety of states. And you've had it quite recently in some states. So I think the Fergusons are prototypical American politicians. And they're probably no better, no worse than similar ones elsewhere.
The Fergusons were passé, but a new hero was on the horizon. W. Lee Pappy O'Daniel of Fort Worth, a flour merchant who sold by radio, had discovered a substitute for promises to tenant farmers, playing country music over the airwaves.
How do you do, ladies and gentlemen, and hello there, boys and girls.
In a 13-man primary, Pappy O'Daniel polled more than half the votes.
Pappy O'Daniel was a political phenomenon. I'd never heard of his like in Texas before or since, at getting votes, getting elected. It didn't last forever. It wore out with his reaction, his failure to deliver his promise. But in his first race, he swept Texas like prairie fire.
Got that $1 million smile. It's the latest thing in style. You know, it's in my walk, and it's in my talk, and it's with me all the while.
W. Lee came along and announced that he was going to run for governor, and he was going to run for governor on the platform of the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule.
And I got that $1 million smile.
Pappy O'Daniel came on the radio at the noon hour every day, 15 minutes with the Light Crust Doughboys. He'd have religious songs, Western songs, country music. That time, very popular. Practically say every housewife who cooked biscuit in Texas was watching him.
W. Lee O'Daniel would talk about his flour and preach a little and pray a little and talk about the Ten Commandments and philosophize, and the people just loved it. And the whole state stopped from 12 to 12:30 every day. Nearly everyone in the state stopped work to listen to W. Lee O'Daniel. He was that popular and that important.
When he announced that he was thinking of running for governor, within 2 weeks' time he announced he had 64,000 letters and postcards urging him to run for governor. And they staged a campaign without a parallel in Texas history. They carried the Light Crust Doughboys, flatbed truck, went over Texas. He didn't make much of a campaign speech, so played that music.
He used that so effectively that in his campaigns, he's a man of the people again, you see. And he portrayed himself that way. And therefore, he would continue this in all of his races, that of the homespun type of individual. You have to keep in mind that this is still really it may be World War II, but this is still not urban Texas as we would know it after World War II. And you have tremendous growth from the rural to the urban areas. In that way, O'Daniel was effective.
You know, they used to say that Texas bragged about being under 6 flags, and old Daniel got elected, they said Texas under 6 flags and a flour sack. But he was one of our politicians.
The band, which was called the Hillbilly Boys, we broadcast, had our broadcast inside the governor's mansion. And we would all convene there, tune up and practice a little bit. And in a particular room of the governor's mansion, he had his transcription equipment set up where he would transcribe, do the radio show and transcribe at the same time. In other words, he would have a copy of it. And we would do our radio show, and he would announce and do his speeches.
The rural Texas that we were of that time enjoyed it and appreciated it, and he made a fine governor as far as everybody's concerned, not because of what he did in office, but because of what he spoke on the radio.
After his re-election in 1940, Pappy Lee invited everybody in Texas to come to his inauguration. And afterwards, he threw a big Texas barbecue. The meat was buffalo, killed by the governor himself for the occasion.
Then 1941 came along, and Morris Shepherd died, and he decided to run for the United States Senate. So he appointed a fellow named Andrew Jackson Houston, who was a descendant of old Sam, and who was very old and who couldn't serve very much or wouldn't serve but for the interim.
And therefore he appointed him so that he could run in 1942 for the post. And that's exactly what would happen. Andrew Jackson Houston made no impression on Congress in the month or so, or year or so he would be there. And then he would run, and then O'Daniel would run for Senate. In this campaign, he came across a relative newcomer, a man by the name of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who surprisingly showed a tremendous amount of political support. But in this one, it was extremely close. O'Daniel won by less than 2,000 votes. I think it was something like 1,300 votes.
The main thing about Pappy was that he was a showman, and perhaps there is a great deal in common between politicians and show people. There's a certain amount of ham in all of us.
One era was over, but a new one was running headlong into history. It started when John Nance Garner, representative from the Southwest Texas ranch country, won the speakership of the United States House of Representatives in 1931.
I made no promises to secure this preferment. I have no promises to make now.
He had that powerful personality that just dominated, absolutely dominated anybody, everybody. He had a strength of personality that was unbelievable, and he knew how to use it.
I have to make.
He was a man who knew what he was doing, he knew what his goals were, and he almost got there.
Cactus Jack Garner went on to become Franklin D. Roosevelt's vice president during FDR's first 2 terms in the White House.
Mr. Speaker, it is very delightful to welcome you here to Hyde Park and to have the chance to talk with my teammate about our plans for the next few months.
Garner's attempt to gain the presidency for himself in 1940 ran into FDR's unprecedented quest for a 3rd term.
Mr. Garner wanted the nomination in 1932 and thought he had a chance to get it. He didn't get it. He accepted the vice presidency on the basis that it was the best thing for the country. He did not want to be vice president. He enjoyed his role as Speaker of the House. He was very proud of the fact that as Speaker of the House, he never lost a vote. And those were the days when votes were lined up and you either voted with the party or you were really out of the party. And he had a one-vote majority in Congress, and he never lost a vote.
Disappointed in his efforts to become president, Garner returned to his Texas ranch to live out his days, grumbling that the vice presidency of the United States wasn't worth a pitcher of warm spit.
He came back to Texas. He made one decision that I think was very wise, and that is, he said, when I cross the Potomac going back to Texas, I will never cross it again. He never went back to Washington. He left as vice president, and he never went back.
Before Garner left Washington, he passed the baton of Texas political leadership to the man who was to be Speaker of the House for a longer time than anyone before or since. Sam Rayburn was present during the unfolding of much of America's 20th century history.
We have put Texas where it belongs, a Democratic state in a Democratic column, and it's going to stay there for many, many years.
He was a man of absolute, complete integrity, and there was never any question. Foes and admirers alike, those who were for him, those who were against him, recognized that here is a man of absolute, complete integrity, a man who believes that his country comes first. And even though some of them might disagree with him on particular issues, they respected him. He had the respect of the members of the House, both Republicans and Democrats. And when he set out a course, it was followed. He was a man who could say, the House will do this, and the House did that.
Some people got the wrong impression of him. Folks would see him on television presiding every 4 years over the Democratic National Convention, and he'd be scowling that inimitable scowl of his and rapping the gavel and seeming irascible. People got the impression, well, this is a crusty, irascible old scoundrel. He's just grouchy sort of a fellow. Well, he wasn't that at all.
Will come to order.
He was a person who was accustomed to and just almost reverential about orderly democratic procedure. Mr. Rayburn was accustomed to presiding in the House chamber where he would rap the gavel gently and order would be restored, and in which there was at least some basic respect for the rules of the House. Suddenly, every 4 years, he'd find himself in this unaccustomed setting, in this weltering sea of humanity, milling and moving around. In the first place, they didn't know the rules, and in the second place, they didn't care. He would rap the gavel gently and nothing would happen. And it would outrage his sense of propriety. And people would see him in that sense of outrage, and they'd draw the conclusion that this is the kind of a person that he was, but he wasn't that kind of a person. Sam Rayburn was a person with a deep sense of patriotic devotion that transcended partisanship.
And at the death of Sam Rayburn, his total estate, I think, amounted to $15,000. And I read that story, and tears literally came to my eyes because the power that that man had and the influence that he wielded, and yet he died with very little money, tells you a great deal about his honesty, and that's something wonderful.
But it would be the man who first tried to prevent Pappy Leo Daniel from going to Washington who would be the first Texan ever to reach the nation's highest political office.
At the time President Johnson became president and into 1965, I think he was still something of a curiosity to a lot of people around the country. I think they were enamored with the idea of having this cowboy president. Obviously, he never was a cowboy, but but he did have cattle, he did have a ranch, and to the rest of the country that was exciting. He wanted to be thought of as the Texas president. He cultivated the idea that a small town boy from Johnson City, Texas, with an education at a teacher college could compete in the national arena with all these sophisticated people from Harvard and Yale and elsewhere on the East Coast. He felt that for too long, Texas had been thought of as the backwater. He did sometimes appear to be sort of a caricature of what Texas people in high public life are supposed to be, but of course beneath that caricature was a brilliant mind and a person who felt for other people, who had a lot of compassion, a lot of generosity, and wanted to do things for people.
Lyndon Johnson's performance on the national stage can't be overestimated for creating a sense on the part of Easterners and on the world stage that Texans are somehow brasher, larger than life, lustier, whatever, than maybe the rest of the country. And there's a kind of wildness and a kind of extravagance and exuberance, a sense of optimism. Johnson did things that were astonishing that we'll not see another president do.
Some reporter asked the president where they cut on him, and somebody said, "Where's your scar?" or "Show me your scar," or something. He just pulled his shirt up and showed the scar. Well, you know, that was him.
Lyndon Baines Johnson was first elected to Congress from an impoverished, hard-scrabble hill country district in the 1930s. His campaign style was in the true Texas tradition. Houston and Hogg would have felt right at home.
That day, Lyndon Johnson will leave his Senate seat and go with them.
When he returned, he ran again, this time against former Governor Coke Stevenson. It was this close, controversial victory in the 1948 primary that earned Johnson the nickname Landslide Lyndon. After a late return from the famous Box 13, Johnson won by just 87 votes.
They were running neck and neck. In the first primary, it came out about 410,000, I think, to about 450,000. Coke was ahead. But in the second primary, Coke played a sort of a defensive campaign, and Johnson hired a helicopter and went all over the state in a helicopter, and most of us hadn't seen a helicopter close up in those days, and we all went out to see Johnson and listen to him, and so by the time the votes came in, they were just neck and neck. When a box would come in from one area, it put Johnson ahead, and the next day Stevenson was ahead, and finally one of the last boxes to report was Precinct 13 over in Alice, over in Jim Wells County. And when that box came in, they had what's claimed to be 203 late ballots that were added to the totals after the polls closed. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but suffice it to say that was the claim, and Johnson won the race by 87 votes when it was all down. Johnson was elected to the Senate, and that started a great career of being President of the United States.
In the Senate, Johnson rode with increasing prosperity. His remarkable cloakroom ability, his force, energy, and empiricism made him perhaps the most effective Senate Majority Leader in history.
He knew how to get votes. He knew how to apply pressure. He knew how to trade off favors for support for something. He always said you have to give a little to get a little. But he was basically a legislator.
There's no question that he will go down in history as the greatest, the most effective leader that the United States Senate ever had. Those were probably his greatest days, were his days as leader of the United States Senate.
Johnson was an enormously effective president at first. His failures would probably be attributed by history less to his mistakes than to his style. Johnson did things for people, but the presidential image in the national mind required more. The very traits that made him a superb senator hampered him in the White House.
Well, one possibility that's been suggested is that Johnson is influenced by Texas history, that the image of the Alamo defenders, men standing up and fighting in the midst of a crisis, influences him, say, in the Vietnam War, that he's reluctant to try to find a way out because he's afraid that someone won't see him as having stood up in a kind of military crisis situation. And so it may have made it more difficult for him to look for alternatives in a war situation later.
He wanted to help people, and he wanted to have civil rights legislation. You know, he brought forth the first civil rights bill ever passed.
The civil rights legislation he got enacted possibly could not have been brought about by anyone other than a Southern president. The fact that he was a Southerner, had considerable influence in the South, enabled the Congress to pick up the additional support necessary to break filibusters and enact meaningful voting rights acts and public accommodations acts, other civil rights legislation. And I know that he always felt that civil rights and education were the two most important aspects of his administration, and that's the way he wanted to be remembered.
But what really matters is not the ultimate judgment that historians are going to pass on the work that we've done in this period or even this administration. But what matters is whether there has really been a change for the better in the way human beings live in this country. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. I really think there has been.
Johnson had been interested in civil rights. He had some personal experiences with the civil rights issue, and he had taught in a Mexican school in South Texas. He had a very deep feeling for Mexican Americans.
I'll never forget growing up, for example, the day that Henry B. Gonzalez was campaigning to become the first Hispanic American to be elected to the United States Congress. And one block from where I lived was the main street that comes through the west side of San Antonio, east-west thoroughfare. And there was a tremendous commotion up there that day, so we went up there, and there was Lyndon Johnson with Cantinflas. And they were campaigning for Henry B. Gonzalez, all three of them in the back seat of a white Lincoln convertible. And by the end of the day, Lyndon Johnson had helped elect Henry Gonzalez, the first Hispanic, to the United States Congress. Johnson felt strongly about Gonzalez. He always had a warm spot for the Hispanic community since the days that he taught at Cotulla, where he was a school teacher and taught Hispanic children. That whole milieu from which he came and helped contribute to the Great Society. All of the legislation that he passed, from civil rights legislation to educational legislation to employment legislation, in part was possible because of his personal witness and relationship with the problems of rural Texas.
The average Texan, I think, disagreed vehemently with a lot of Lyndon Johnson's policies and programs and his political philosophy, so to speak. But it goes back to the old saying about he's a son of a gun, but he's our son of a gun. He was a Texan, and the Texans voted for him.
Like many in the land, the Texas state legislature is often accused of being inefficient, outmoded, and corrupt. However, over the past 100 years, it has clearly served the needs of the majority of the people in the state, as that majority has seen those needs.
Across the prairies, the winds of change are bringing new style to Texas politics and a wider range of participants. As Texas became more urbanized in the middle 20th century, a longtime minority in Texas politics, Republicans, re-emerged to power after a century of Democratic dominance.
The big change, of course, is the emergence of the Republican Party in Texas. When I was elected to public office, I was the first Republican elected in a statewide race in Texas since the Reconstruction period. But of course, since that time, Bill Clements has been elected, and I've been reelected.
Probably the most interesting thing that is happening politically in our time is to look back retrospectively for maybe 50 years to the mid-30s and think of this state then as a political body versus the way it is today. Not only as it relates to the population and the demographics of that population, the black minority, the brown minority, the far eastern minority coming in here from Asia, as well as this in-migration from other states. The profile of Texas has changed enormously. We're a state in transition, literally.
Yes, urbanization has come to Texas, and it's said that that's where the Republicans are strongest. But I live in a mighty rural part of the world, and I see people believing more and more that the ultra-liberal Democratic National Party has left Texans. And Texas Democrats who don't believe in extremist leftist positions are increasingly going to the Republican Party. So I think we have a fabulous future.
I think you're going to see a situation with a continued drift of more conservatives in the Republican Party, probably, and probably more liberals in the Democratic Party. The line may become a little sharper between the two parties in the future.
If you go back even 30 years, the Democratic Party was primarily a populist party that was trying to promote the basic values of the small working farmer, the person blue and white collar who was working for a living and trying to provide for his or her future and the future of their children. I think what has changed is that the Democratic Party in both Texas and nationally has become the party of government.
The National Democratic Party is so far over to the left and has been that most Texas Democrats are finding, hey, listen, I just don't feel comfortable with that. Not that they're instant Republicans, but they just don't feel comfortable with the liberal policies of the National Democratic Party.
I think it is becoming a two-party state. My party, the Democratic Party, which always has been the dominant party in our state, is going to have to develop strengths that we haven't had as a party, and we're going to have to cause those strengths of individual personality to cohere and emerge so that they present a more united front if we are to be leaders.
I think the Democratic Party will continue for the foreseeable future to be the dominant party in Texas, though I think it will be contested, and I think the party's going to have to sort of think hard and trim down the fat, lean up its message, put aside some of its luxurious temptation to fiddle with fringe causes, and get back to talking about what the people of Texas really need to hear for the future. People of Texas had a love affair with the Democratic Party, and I think it continues.
Politics also reflect demographic changes, and changes in attitudes as well as economic changes. The change that is taking place in Texas, of course, with the rising percentage of Hispanic population, is the election of more Hispanics to office. This will certainly continue.
Well, Texas has always had a good voter participation by Hispanics. In the gubernatorial election of 1982, Hispanics admittedly made the difference in who was elected governor, and we elected a Democratic governor.
Hispanics anticipate having approximately 1 million registered voters in Texas very shortly. And we are seeing more and more Hispanics elected to local offices, mayor, city commission, county commissioner.
What used to be the black and white Texas is now a multicolored Texas, and that's all involved in educational opportunities. The beginning of blacks participating in government probably started at maybe school board and city council levels some years ago, sporadically around the state, primarily in areas that were very predominantly black populated.
The state that elected the first woman to a full term as governor has continued to set precedents.
We are one of the few states who have had a woman governor, of course, Mrs. Ferguson, who was governor 2 times. We've had women active in the women's suffrage movement.
I always say that they've told us before that women couldn't get involved in politics because politics was dirty. And I've never seen anything in politics as dirty as dried egg on a plate that I faced many mornings over a sink.
And women have been active politically in Texas for a long time. We know of Barbara Jordan, who's one of the most distinguished political figures in the country.
I think that we're good at politics. We are very hardworking. We're detail-oriented. We like to make sure that there be a meeting of the minds, if that's possible. We're really good negotiators. And in the political world, that's a real advantage.
Well, who was the first woman ever nominated to be Vice President of the United States? A Texas woman, Sissy Farenthold.
For those of us who have knocked on that door of opportunity and found that it was closed a lot of the time, once we get into positions of responsibility, we want to make sure that we share it, and that not only women, but Hispanics, blacks, Orientals, all of those who make up the face of Texas be given an opportunity in the public sector.
Would you please rise for the pledge to the Texas flag?
I just hope we keep in Texas, no matter how much we change or how much high technology we get, we keep producing people who have their feet on the ground and whose personal memory is rooted in the great traditions of Texas, because we will have national figures who will make national policy, and let's hope they do it firmly rooted in the clay soil of Texas, in the traditions of how real people live, and not just in the rarefied atmosphere of some new high-tech Texas that seems to be emerging.
Texans like fun and fury in political campaigns, but the forces against real change have always been massive. Special interests could be blamed, and they have been, but the basic inertia lies in the genuine conservatism of the Texan. That's changing, of course, with the sweeping tides of the Second World War, with urbanization, with immigration. But the changes have been long in coming, and many are still underway. Today, humble origins remain a plus for any Texas politician. Wealth is acceptable if it's self-made. Family money won't hurt you too badly if you've done something to make more of it. God still helps those who help themselves. The Texans are looking for greater substance in their leaders now. It's unlikely that another Pappy Leo Daniel could be elected on the strength of a good country band. Now, I only said it was unlikely, not impossible. Next week on Lone Star, we'll look at Texas today and see what happened when the city started to grow and Texas went to town.
We were a state that had a positive, optimistic outlook even when things were really bad, and now we've become an urban state.
Houston grew up more southern than western. Cowboys and Indians never had a whole lot of influence here.
I think Dallas is really a unique city as far as why it is such a great city. It's mainly a people city. I'm very bullish on Texas's future.
I'm rather curious as to why the state is so absolutely addicted to football, but it is, just consumed by football.
You know, being from Mexico, we can catch them and send them back. They'll be trying it in 15 minutes.
I think ultimately, rather than Silicon Valley, it's going to be a Silicon Corridor. And that there's a good prospect of that corridor running all the way from San Antonio to Dallas-Fort Worth, with some spin-offs in other directions off of that.
I'm Larry Hagman. Good night.
Major funding for Lone Star is provided by Foley's and Sanger Harris, divisions of Federated Department Stores Incorporated, the John G. and Marie Stella Kennedy Memorial Foundation, and the Meadows Foundation. Additional funding is provided by the following organizations: The Lone Star television series is based on the book Lone Star by T.R. Fehrenbach.
Video cassettes from the series Lone Star are available through KEDT TV in Corpus Christi. Cost is $29 per program or $200 for the entire 8-part series. To order, call 1-800-307-KEDT during business hours.